Hello, my name is Jordan Bodnick, and today I will be on the opposition opposing the motion this House believes publishers have a moral obligation to refuse to distribute deeply offensive literature. To start, I will begin with a list of the three anticipated proposition and opposition contentions. The first proposition contention is power equals responsibility. Publishers profit from distribution and hold institutional power, therefore creating a moral duty to refuse content that causes harm to others. This responsibility is similar to other powerful institutions that have ethical obligations to their own communities. The second proposition argument is offensive content is easily identifiable. Deeply offensive can be clearly defined as content that targets protected groups through dehumanization and hate speech rhetoric. With this precise definition, the obligation becomes concrete and achievable without collapsing into censorship. And the third and final proposition contention is the already set precedent. Publishers already refuse harmful content like child exploitation and slander in the status quo, demonstrating that refusal mechanisms exist and work effectively. Adding a moral obligation to refuse offensive literature is a consistent and natural extension of existing practice. Next, I will introduce the three opposition arguments. The first opposition contention is subjectivity kills the obligation. Offensiveness is radically contextual and culturally contested with no natural metric to define objectively. Any attempt to define deeply offensive either expands into censorship or becomes so narrow that the obligation becomes redundant. The second opposition contention is taking away free speech. Once you establish that publishers have a moral obligation based on subjective offense, institutional gatekeeping and self-censorship spiral, therefore systematically excluding attested voices from public discourse. Market mechanisms prevent these events from happening far better than institutional obligation does. And third and final opposition argument is the market already works. Publishers already face reputational and financial incentives to avoid controversial content that damages their brand, making the moral obligation entirely redundant. Imposing a coercive obligation replaces a healthy market choice with institutional gatekeeping by whoever who holds power in the status quo. My time starts now. Throughout this debate, Proposition has made one key strategical error. They've asked you to vote for a framework, a moral obligation to refuse deeply offensive literature, without grappling with what that actually means in practice and what the impact will be. Because once you accept this framework, Judge, you're not protecting readers from harm. Instead, readers are subject to the exact same content across all writing sources, as no piece of literature challenged the status quo. We will introduce two voter issues in the speech, showing you clearly where to vote for the opposition. The first voter issue is propositions to undefined terms destroy publishing. Prop's framework doesn't work because they can't define the two things they're asking for, and that collapse has significant consequences. First, you cannot define deeply offensive. Prop says targeted dehumanization of protected groups. But what does that actually mean, Judge? Is discussing a controversial historical event dehumanizing to descendants? Is writing about gender identity in a way that challenges mainstream thought dehumanizing? Different communities have completely different answers, therefore, there's no objective standard. Secondly, if you can't define something deeply offensive, you are unable to tie a moral obligation to it. A moral obligation is only applicable if you know what violates it. But Prop standard is so vague that publishers have no idea when they've crossed the line. So what happens? Two options, both very harmful. Option one, writers get paralyzed. They don't know what counts as offensive, so they write nothing controversial. Nothing that challenges, nothing that disrupts the status quo is written. You lose entire categories of literature because authors are terrified of unknowingly violating some undefined moral obligation. Option two, the obligation becomes whatever the writer wants it to be. A publisher refuses a book and claims they had a moral obligation to. An author writes something deliberately cruel, a targeted attack, and claims they had a moral obligation to. Because the obligation is undefined, it becomes a blank check. Writers and publishers invoke it to justify whatever they want. Proposition to create a system where everyone uses the same moral language to justify completely opposite action that creates chaos within the publishing world. The second voter issue is the market already works and adding an obligation breaks it. Publishers make decisions based on what their readers want, what their communities values, and what sells. A publishers in San Francisco makes completely different choices than a publishers in Morocco because their readers are different. That's not a flaw, that's how the system is supposed to work. However, Prop's obligation changes everything. Publishers stop making decisions based on what readers want. They start making decisions based on whether something offends people. And the moment that happens, the market loses its composure. Now, a publisher doesn't think about whether their readers want this. They think about whether it's offensive. And once they start thinking about it that way, every other publisher thinks the same way. They all come to the exact same conclusion. Any piece of literature that critiques social norms will inevitably offend someone. So every writer refuses to write that piece, not because readers don't want it, but because the obligation says they shouldn't publish it. So what happens to the writers? They see that no publisher will touch anything controversial, so they stop writing it. The person who needs to read a challenging perspective on identity can't find it anywhere. The community with an unpopular viewpoint can't get published because every publisher decides it's offensive. Democracy just requires people to see ideas different from their own. Writers are now motivated by the fear of offending someone, so they never read anything controversial and interesting. The impact is that readers can't access the ideas they need. Writers stop challenging anything. Entire communities disappear. Proposition has made culture smaller and weaker. They make it impossible to actually figure out what's right and wrong, which writing is supposed to highlight. To conclude, Proposition wants you to accept a framework where publishers have a moral obligation to refuse deeply offensive content. But that framework centralizes power in institutional gatekeepers whose definition of offensive changes with political pressure. The result is systematic exclusion of contested voices. The market system we have now, while messy, disturbed, and contested, is far better than the obligation-based system a prop proposes because it keeps power distributed and allows ideas to survive. At the point of which the market stays intact and literature challenges mainstream thought, I'm so proud to oppose. Thank you.